Chapter 1 The Reliable Uncle. Brian Kennedy had developed a talent for showing up exactly when he was needed and staying just long enough to fix things without drawing attention to himself. It wasn't flashy, and it wasn't particularly celebrated, but it was dependable, which, in his experience, was more valuable than grand gestures that couldn't be maintained. At 35, he had thought he'd be further along in life, though he was never entirely sure what that meant anymore. There had been a time when he believed he'd be married by now, possibly negotiating bedtime routines and arguing over which cartoon qualified as too loud. Instead, he lived in a quiet apartment that rarely required more than a single lamp turned on at night. That silence had grown louder after his almost engagement. Almost was the word that stuck. It lingered in his thoughts like a sentence that never quite ended properly. He'd been close enough to have opinions on wedding venues, close enough to memorize her coffee order without asking, close enough to believe that the future had already been decided. And then, one ordinary Tuesday evening, he'd noticed the glow of her phone and the unmistakable swipe he recognized from his own brief, unsuccessful ventures into dating apps. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene. He had simply asked, calmly, "Are you still on those?" The answer had been worse than denial. "Yes, but it's not what you think." Brian had learned that anything following that sentence was precisely what you thought, only explained in more creative ways. The engagement never happened. The ring, which he'd hidden in a sock drawer like a cliché he never intended to become, remained there until he returned it quietly, keeping the receipt as a reminder not of the money, but of the lesson. The lesson, unfortunately, had stuck harder than anything else. "You're thinking again." Brian blinked, dragging himself back to the present. He looked down to find his niece staring up at him with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for suspicious strangers. "I'm allowed to think," he replied. "Not when you're supposed to be pushing me higher," she countered, thrusting her legs forward on the swing. Her brother, Brian's nephew, stood nearby, arms folded with exaggerated impatience. "You're doing it wrong. You have to go on the count of 3. Brian smiled despite himself. "Oh, do I?" "Yes," the boy insisted. "That's the rule." "Whose rule?" "Ours," they said in unison. Brian stepped behind the swing, gripping the chains. "All right, your rules. But if you go into orbit, I'm not explaining that to your mother." "That's not how space works," his niece said matter-of-factly. "Good," Brian said, "because I'd make a terrible astronaut." "1," his nephew began. "2," his niece added. Wait," Brian interrupted. "Are we factoring in wind resistance?" Neither child answered. They just looked at him. "3," they shouted together. Brian gave a steady push, sending the swing arcing upward with a delighted squeal. There it was, that sound. He'd come to realize it was the most reliable form of happiness he had access to. Sunday afternoons had become his ritual. On the weekends when the kids weren't with his brother, Brian would kidnap them. His word, not theirs, and take them out for whatever they collectively decided qualified as adventure. Ice cream, movies, parks, or occasionally something disastrously educational that he immediately regretted. Their mother was always invited. Sometimes she joined them, sometimes she didn't, but the invitation never changed. To Brian, it wasn't optional. Titles had shifted, but reality hadn't. She was still family. That consistency had apparently confused his brother. "You still hang out with her?" his brother had asked weeks earlier, the question carrying more accusation than curiosity. Brian had shrugged. "She's still their mother." "That's not the same thing." "It is to them," Brian replied, "which makes it the same thing to me." The conversation hadn't ended there, but Brian had. He wasn't interested in negotiating basic decency. Now, watching his niece and nephew argue about whose turn it was to jump off the swing mid-flight, a discussion Brian was already preparing to veto, he felt that familiar certainty settle over him. This part of his life made sense. Relationships, on the other hand, had stopped making sense a while ago. "Uncle Brian." He turned toward the voice, expecting one of the kids, but instead found himself looking at a woman crouched near the sandbox. She wasn't speaking to him, at least not yet. She was addressing a small boy who appeared to be negotiating with gravity in a way that suggested he might lose. "Your truck doesn't need to go that fast," she said, holding it steady. "It's not in a race." "It is now," the boy replied with serious conviction. Brian watched the exchange longer than necessary, something about it anchoring his attention. The woman's tone was calm but playful, firm without being rigid. She didn't overpower the conversation. She guided it. "That's because I know things," the boy said confidently. She smiled. "That doesn't mean the truck won't flip over. It's a strong truck." "All right," she conceded, sitting back slightly, "but I'm not catching it if it goes flying this time." Brian didn't realize he was smiling until his nephew tugged on his sleeve. "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Thinking." Brian exhaled softly. "I'm observing." "That's worse." Before he could respond, his niece pointed. "We're getting ice cream now." "That's not how plans work," Brian said. "It is," she insisted. "We already decided." Brian rubbed his temples. "When did this decision occur?" "Just now." "Of course it did." "Fine," he said. "But only if you're Brian, right?" He turned again, surprised to find the woman from the sandbox now standing beside them. Up close, she looked equally composed and amused, as though life's minor chaos amused her more than it bothered her. That depends, Brian said. Am I in trouble? She laughed, a quick, genuine sound. No, I just overheard them calling you. She paused, gesturing vaguely toward the boy. That's my nephew. He's convinced this playground belongs to him. Brian glanced at the boy, who was now attempting to prove that point physically. Bold strategy, Brian said. I respect the ambition. She tilted her head slightly. Do you always negotiate playground treaties? Only on Sundays. That's specific. I'm a man of routine. She considered that for a moment, then smiled again. I like that. Brian wasn't sure what to do with that statement. Fortunately, his niece saved him. We're getting ice cream, she announced. You can come if you want. Brian closed his eyes briefly. We don't invite strangers, he said. I'm not a stranger, the woman replied lightly. I have a nephew. That's basically a background check. Brian met her eyes again, caught somewhere between amusement and something unfamiliar he hadn't felt in a while. Curiosity. Ice cream then, he said before he could overthink it. And just like that, his carefully predictable Sunday had shifted. Quietly, unexpectedly, and entirely beyond his control. Chapter 2, Accidental Introductions. Brian quickly learned that inviting an unexpected person into a well-established routine had consequences. Most of them unpredictable, some of them deeply inconvenient, and at least one of them, interesting. The ice cream shop sat 2 blocks from the park, a modest place with a faded striped awning and a line that never seemed to move, but somehow always progressed. Brian had been there enough times to know the rhythm of it. What he hadn't factored in was how the dynamic would shift with a newcomer. I call chocolate, his nephew declared before they even reached the door. You always call chocolate, his niece replied. That's not calling it. That's just repeating yourself. It's my favorite. That doesn't make it exclusive. Brian opened the door for them, glancing over his shoulder to make sure their unexpected guest was still following. She was, walking beside them as though she'd always been part of the group rather than someone they'd met less than 20 minutes ago. You seem very calm about all this, Brian said quietly as she stepped inside. I grew up with 3 siblings, she replied. This feels manageable. Give it time, he said. She smiled, slipping her hands into her jacket pockets. I'm Emma, by the way. Since your niece already invited me to join your outing, I figured names might be useful. Brian, he said, nodding. Though apparently that information is already public. Very public, Emma said. You've built quite a reputation as Uncle Brian. He sighed lightly. I was hoping that wouldn't become a brand. It's too late, she said. You've been labeled. Ahead of them, the kids had already reached the counter, studying the menu with the seriousness of people making life-altering decisions. They'll stand there forever, Brian said. It's part of the process. Emma leaned slightly to the side to observe them. They look like a negotiation is about to happen. It always happens, he confirmed. One of them will try to convince the other that their flavor choice is objectively better. And is it? No, Brian said. But they commit to the argument completely. Emma laughed again, softer this time, as if she were beginning to enjoy the predictability of it all. What about you? She asked. Do you have a default order? Vanilla, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Really? It's reliable. That's your reasoning? It doesn't pretend to be anything it's not, Brian replied. It shows up, does its job, and doesn't disappoint you by trying to be more complicated than it is. Emma studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. That might be the most serious explanation for vanilla ice cream I've ever heard. I've had time to think about it, he said dryly. She stepped closer to the menu, scanning it. I'm more of a try something new and regret it later person. That sounds stressful. It is, she admitted. But occasionally it works out. Brian considered that. Occasionally. There was something unsettling about how that word lingered, how it implied risk without guarantee. Uncle Brian, his nephew called. She's cheating. Brian looked over. How is anyone cheating in this situation? She's trying to get 2 flavors, his nephew said. That's allowed, Brian said. Not when I only get 1. You didn't ask for 2. I shouldn't have to ask, the boy insisted. It should be understood. Brian pinched the bridge of his nose. Nothing in this world is understood, unless you say it out loud. Emma leaned slightly toward him. That feels like a life rule, not an ice cream rule. It applies to both, he said. They stepped forward as the line moved, and within minutes the children had resolved their argument in the only way they ever did, by forgetting it entirely once they were handed their cones. Emma chose something with far too many colors to be considered safe. Confident, Brian commented. Reckless, she corrected. There's a difference. You're embracing uncertainty. I am, she said, taking a cautious bite. She paused, considering, then shrugged. It's not terrible. That's quite the endorsement. It's better than deeply regrettable, she said. They found a table near the window, the kids immediately launching into a discussion about whether sprinkles improved or distracted from ice cream as a concept. Brian watched them for a moment, then leaned back slightly, allowing himself to relax into the familiar scene, with one noticeable exception. Emma. So, she said, resting her elbow on the table. You do this every Sunday? More or less. That's really nice, she said. And there was no trace of politeness in it, just simple honesty. It's routine, Brian replied. Routine doesn't cancel out nice, she said. Most people don't show up this consistently. Brian glanced at the kids again. They make it easy. That's not what it looks like from here, she said. He let out a quiet breath, not entirely sure how to respond to that. You said something earlier, she continued, stirring her melting ice cream absently, about being a man of routine. Is that by choice or experience? Brian hesitated. It wasn't a difficult question, but it wasn't a simple one either. Experience, he said finally. Emma nodded, as though she'd expected that answer. I used to think I was good at reading people, he added, surprising himself slightly. Turns out I was just good at filling in gaps with what I wanted to see. Emma didn't interrupt. She just listened. That's a very specific, she said after a moment. It's a refined skill, Brian replied. Self-delusion. Most people don't admit that out loud. Most people don't learn from it either, he said. She tilted her head slightly, studying him again with that same thoughtful expression. It wasn't judgmental. If anything, it felt curious. And now? She asked. Now I stick to things that are clear, he said. No guessing. No assumptions. Emma considered that, then glanced at the kids, who were now debating whether it was physically possible to eat ice cream faster than it melted. And people? She asked. Do they fall into that category? Brian followed her gaze. They're harder, he said. They change the rules without telling you. Emma smiled faintly. Sometimes they don't know the rules themselves. That doesn't make it easier. No, she admitted. It doesn't. There was a pause, not uncomfortable but not empty either. It felt like something was settling between them, something unspoken but understood. Brian shifted slightly, breaking the moment before it became something he couldn't categorize. So, he said, you mentioned your nephew. Is this a regular outing for you, too? Emma shook her head. Not exactly. I fill in when needed. Today just happened to be one of those days. Temporary responsibility, Brian said. Flexible responsibility, she corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Yes, she said. Temporary implies you're waiting for it to end. Flexible means you're choosing to be there when it matters. Brian absorbed that. It was a subtle distinction, but it landed with more weight than he expected. Across the table, his niece suddenly leaned forward. Are you coming next Sunday? Both Brian and Emma blinked. I what? Emma said, caught off guard. You should come, his niece insisted. We do different things every time. That's a very generous invitation, Emma said carefully, glancing at Brian. Brian opened his mouth to intervene, to restore some level of normalcy, but hesitated. Instead, he heard himself say, we do rotate activities. Emma's eyes flicked back to his, a hint of amusement there now. I can see that, she said. There's a system. There's always a system, Brian replied. She smiled, then turned back to his niece. All right, she said. If I'm free, I'll come. Good, his nephew said decisively. Because next week we're doing something better than ice cream. Brian folded his arms. That's a bold claim. It's already decided, the boy said. Of course it is, Brian muttered. Emma leaned back slightly, her expression relaxed now, as if she'd quietly settled into the rhythm of their chaos. And Brian realized, somewhat unexpectedly, that the routine he'd relied on so heavily hadn't been disrupted. It had simply expanded, which he thought might be worse, or just possibly better. Chapter 3: Lines That Don't Move. By the time Sunday came around again, Brian had already convinced himself that the previous week had been an anomaly. People didn't just group themselves into your life that easily, not without complications, expectations, or a sudden realization that everything felt a little too fast. Those kinds of moments, in Brian's experience, tended to correct themselves naturally. A missed plan, a polite cancellation, the gradual drift of intentions that never quite solidified into anything real. So, when he pulled up outside his former sister-in-law's house, he assumed the day would unfold exactly as it always had. Predictable, contained, manageable. His nephew flung the door open before Brian could knock. You're late, the boy announced. Brian checked his watch. I'm 2 minutes early. That's late if we're ready already. Brian stepped inside, shaking his head. That's not how time works. You don't get to redefine it because you're impatient. I think he just did, came a familiar voice from the kitchen. Brian turned, finding his former sister-in-law leaning against the counter, coffee in hand. She looked tired but composed, the kind of tired that came from managing everything without letting it show too much. Morning, she said, offering a small smile. Morning, Brian replied. They've already informed me I'm failing at punctuality. That sounds about right, she said. They've been waiting by the door since 9. It's 10:30, Brian said. Exactly, she replied. From somewhere deeper in the house, his niece called out, Are we still going? Or are we just talking about going? We're going, Brian answered. I wouldn't risk the consequences otherwise. You shouldn't, she said, appearing in the hallway with shoes only halfway tied. We made a plan. Brian crouched down to fix the laces. I heard rumors about that. It's not a rumor, she said. It's a schedule. Brian paused mid-knot, glancing up at her. Since when do you have a schedule? Since last week, she replied confidently. Brian blinked once. That was new. All right, he said slowly. What exactly is this schedule? It's a surprise, his nephew said. Which means it's not organized, Brian muttered. It is organized, his niece insisted. We already told Emma. At the mention of her name, Brian's hands stilled briefly. Of course they had. Did you now? He said carefully, finishing the knot. She said she might come, his nephew added, as if that were a minor detail. Brian stood, brushing his hands off. And what does might mean in this context? It means yes, both children said in unison. That's not what that means, Brian replied. From the kitchen, their mother hid a faint smile behind her coffee. Good luck, she said. Brian gave her a look. You're enjoying this. A little, she admitted. It's nice seeing them excited about something new. Brian glanced back at the kids, who were now hovering expectantly near the door. Something new. There it was again, that phrase that never quite sat comfortably with him anymore. All right, he said, grabbing his keys. Let's go discover what organized surprise means. The plan, as it turned out, was the zoo. Brian found this out after 20 minutes of vague directions, 2 contradictory explanations, and a passionate argument about whether penguins counted as birds or something else entirely. They're birds, Brian said, navigating the parking lot. They can't fly, his nephew countered. That's not the only qualification. They swim, his niece added. So do some birds. Name one, his nephew challenged. Brian opened his mouth, closed it. Penguins, he said. That's cheating. Why is that cheating? Because we were talking about penguins, Brian sighed. You can't create a rule after the argument starts. Yes, we can, they both said. Of course they could. Brian pulled into a parking space, cutting the engine. We're ending this conversation before it becomes legally binding. They piled out of the car, energy already building as they spotted the entrance ahead. Brian followed at a more measured pace, scanning the crowd more out of habit than intention. And then he saw her. Emma stood just outside the gates, her hands tucked loosely into her jacket pockets, her posture relaxed but attentive. She wasn't searching for them. She was simply waiting, as though she trusted they'd find her eventually, which Brian realized they just had. There she is, his niece shouted, taking off at full speed. Emma's face lit up as the children barreled toward her, her laughter carrying easily over the noise of the crowd. You made it, she said, crouching slightly as they reached her. We told you we would, his nephew said, as if that had been the question. Brian approached more slowly, suddenly aware of something he hadn't considered before. She hadn't forgotten. Hi, Emma said, looking up at him. I wasn't sure if the invitation still stood. Brian gestured vaguely toward the children, who were already explaining the entire plan at once. I don't think it was optional. Good, she said lightly. I didn't want to invite myself twice. Brian huffed a quiet laugh. For what it's worth, they would have found you eventually. I believe that, she said, glancing at them. They seem determined. That's one word for it. They stood there for a moment, the same comfortable, undefined pause settling between them again. Zoo was their idea? She asked. Apparently, Brian said. Though the definition of idea is still under review. Emma smiled. I like it. Feels ambitious. It feels loud, Brian corrected. Same thing sometimes. Before he could respond, his niece grabbed Emma's hand. We have to go see the penguins first, she said urgently. Of course you do, Emma replied, allowing herself to be pulled forward. Brian fell into step beside them, watching as Emma matched the kids' pace without effort, asking questions, listening to their answers as if each one mattered. It wasn't forced. It wasn't performative. It was natural. You're doing it again, Emma said quietly. Brian blinked. What? Observing. He exhaled softly. It's hard not to. Is that a good thing or a defensive thing? She asked. Brian considered the question longer than he expected. Both, he admitted. Emma nodded, as though that answer made sense. They reached the penguin exhibit, where the earlier debate resumed immediately with renewed intensity. There, Brian said, gesturing toward the enclosure. Birds. Emma leaned against the railing, watching them glide through the water. They do look more like swimmers. Don't encourage them, Brian said. I'm not, she replied. I'm appreciating nuance. That sounds dangerous. It usually is, she said. Brian glanced at her, catching the hint of something in her tone, something that suggested experience, maybe even understanding. Of what exactly he wasn't sure. The kids moved on quickly after that, dragging them from exhibit to exhibit with relentless enthusiasm. Through it all, Emma stayed fully present, never lagging behind, never stepping out of the rhythm Brian had grown used to managing alone. At some point, he realized something subtle but undeniable. The day didn't feel more complicated. Felt easier, which didn't make sense. "Hey," Emma said, nudging his arm lightly as they paused near a shaded bench. "Can I ask you something?" "You're going to anyway," Brian said. She smiled. "True. Why do you always invite their mom?" Brian didn't hesitate. "Because nothing changed," he said simply. "Not where it matters." Emma studied him, her expression thoughtful again. "Most people don't see it that way," she said. "Most people make things harder than they need to be," Brian replied. "And you don't." "I try not to," he said. "Titles change. Roles don't." Emma nodded slowly, as though turning that over in her mind. "That's rare," she said. "Or impractical," Brian offered. She shook her head. "No, it's steady." Brian looked away briefly, watching as his niece attempted to explain something elaborate to her brother that he clearly wasn't following. Steady. That was a word he understood. "That's the goal," he said quietly. Emma smiled, but there was something different in it this time. Something less amused and more certain. "Then you're doing better than you think," she said. Brian didn't respond right away. For once, he wasn't entirely sure what to say. And that, more than anything else, unsettled him. Chapter 4 Misread Signals. Brian had always believed that clarity was something you built deliberately. Through consistency, through restraint, through refusing to let things drift into ambiguity. It was one of the few principles he trusted without hesitation. Which was precisely why, standing outside a bookstore cafe the following Wednesday evening, he felt a distinctly unfamiliar sense of uncertainty. "This is not a date," he muttered to himself. The words sounded less convincing out loud. It had been Emma's idea, casual, almost incidental. "I usually stop by that place after work sometimes," she'd said when they were leaving the zoo. "Good coffee, quiet. If you ever feel like expanding your routine." Expanding your routine. At the time, Brian had nodded, filed it away as conversational politeness, and assumed it would remain exactly that. And then, 3 days later, he'd walked past the cafe on his way home, slowed without meaning to, and somehow found himself stepping inside. Which, in his defense, still didn't mean anything. Just coffee. Just incidental overlap. Just, "Brian." He turned. Emma stood a few feet away, one hand wrapped around a takeaway cup, the other holding a book against her side. She looked mildly surprised, but not entirely. More like someone whose expectation had quietly been confirmed. "You're here," she said. "Ah, yes," he replied, immediately aware of how weak that sounded. "Coincidentally." "Coincidentally," she repeated, her mouth curving slightly. "That must happen to you a lot." "Not usually," he admitted. She stepped closer, glancing briefly toward the counter. "Did you at least get coffee? Or are you committing to the coincidence without any supporting evidence?" Brian exhaled. "I was about to." "Good," she said. "Otherwise, I would have had questions." He ordered quickly, vanilla latte because of course it was, and joined her at a small table near the window. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, but it wasn't entirely comfortable either. It had a different texture than Sundays, less structured, less buffered by the chaos of children and the steady rhythm of shared responsibility. It was just the two of them. "Midweek is quieter," Emma said, setting her book down. "Less dramatic." "That depends on your definition of dramatic," Brian replied. "My Sundays have a very specific kind of intensity." "I saw that," she said. "It's impressive." He gave a small shrug. "It's routine." Emma leaned back slightly, studying him. "You say that like it explains everything." "It explains enough," he said. "Does it?" she asked. Brian hesitated, then took a sip of his coffee, buying himself a moment. "It's reliable," he said finally. Emma nodded slowly, but there was something unreadable in her expression. "Reliable isn't the same as complete," she said. Brian looked at her. "It doesn't have to be." "Maybe not," she conceded. "But sometimes it should be." He didn't respond right away. There it was again, that gentle pressure, not forceful, not confrontational, but persistent enough to make him examine thoughts he'd already decided were settled. Emma picked up her book, tapping the cover lightly. "I come here to reset," she said. "End of the day. Clear my head. Remind myself that not everything needs to be solved immediately." "That sounds inefficient," Brian said. She laughed softly. "It's not about efficiency. It's about balance." "I prefer clarity," he replied. "I can tell," she said. "You draw very clean lines. They're easier to manage. They're also easier to hide behind," she added lightly. Brian met her gaze, caught off guard by the accuracy of it more than the statement itself. "I'm not hiding," he said. Emma tilted her head. "No, no," he said, a little firmer this time. "I'm prioritizing what works." "And what doesn't?" she asked. Brian set his cup down. "Doesn't get prioritized," he said. Emma watched him carefully, as though weighing that answer. That's one way to handle things, she said. Not the only way. Brian let out a quiet breath. You're very comfortable challenging people. I'm very comfortable asking questions, she corrected. There's a difference. There's a similarity too. Maybe, she said. But I'm not trying to change your answers. I'm just curious how you got to them. Brian leaned back slightly, folding his arms. That sounds like a polite way of saying you don't agree with me, he said. Emma smiled. I didn't say that. You implied it. I acknowledged that there are other perspectives, she replied. You seem to prefer one. I prefer the one that doesn't lead to unnecessary complications, he said. Emma nodded as though she expected that. And how's that working for you? She asked. The question landed more heavily than it should have. Brian didn't answer immediately. Across the cafe, someone laughed, too loud for the space, prompting a brief ripple of annoyance that passed just as quickly. It's stable, he said. Emma didn't look convinced. But not satisfying, she added. That's subjective, Brian replied. So is stable, she said. He almost smiled. Almost. You're very good at this, he said. At what? Making things more complicated than they need to be. Emma laughed again, softer this time. Or maybe I just notice where they already are. There was a pause, longer than the others, stretching just enough to shift the tone of the conversation. Brian found himself watching her in a way he hadn't during the past 2 Sundays, without the buffer of distraction, without the excuse of divided attention. It was different, and that difference unsettled him. So, he said, breaking the moment, do you usually meet strangers halfway through the week? Or is that part of your flexible responsibility philosophy? Emma raised an eyebrow, amused. You're not a stranger anymore. That feels like a fast transition. We've spent 2 Sundays navigating zoo debates and ice cream disputes together, she said. That accelerates things. Brian considered that. That's not inaccurate, he admitted. Emma picked up her cup, taking a slow sip. So what is this then? She asked. Brian blinked. What do you mean? She gestured lightly between them. This, today. You walked in here coincidentally. But you stayed. Brian frowned slightly. It's just coffee. Is it? She asked. Yes, he said a little too quickly. Emma didn't press. She simply nodded, as though accepting his answer on the surface while quietly setting it aside. All right, she said. Just coffee. Something about the way she said it made it feel less like agreement and more like patience. And for reasons Brian couldn't fully explain, that bothered him. Saturday came with an unexpected complication. You're distracted. Brian looked down to find his niece studying him again. Her expression sharp with the kind of perceptiveness he was beginning to suspect couldn't be easily avoided. I'm not distracted, he said. You forgot to answer me twice, she said. That's not proof. It is when it happens twice in the same minute, she countered. His nephew looked up from the floor, where he was constructing something elaborate out of mismatched blocks. Is it about Emma? Brian nearly dropped the glass of water he was holding. No, he said too quickly. Why would it be about Emma? His nephew shrugged. Because you're doing that thing. What thing? The thinking thing, his niece said. That's not a thing, he replied. It is when you don't hear anything else, she said. Brian exhaled slowly, setting the glass down. I hear everything, he said. Then what did I just say? She asked. He paused. You asked a question, he said. She folded her arms. His nephew grinned. See. Brian ran a hand through his hair. This is not a cross-examination. It is if you're guilty, his nephew said. Of what? Something, the boy replied. Brian stared at them for a moment, caught between irritation and reluctant amusement. You're both very confident for people who don't have any evidence, he said. We have instincts, his niece replied. That's worse, Brian muttered. She smiled, satisfied. By Sunday, the distraction hadn't gone away. It had, if anything, sharpened, settling into the edges of his thoughts in a way that made his usual sense of control feel slightly thinner. And as he pulled up outside their mother's house once again, Brian realized something he hadn't fully acknowledged before. This wasn't just about Emma. It was about what she represented. Uncertainty, possibility, something that didn't fit neatly into the clean lines he'd built for himself. And for the first time in a long time, Brian wasn't entirely sure whether to step toward it or draw the line more firmly than ever. Chapter 5, Brotherly Friction. Brian hadn't planned on seeing his brother that evening. In truth, he hadn't planned on seeing him at all outside of the natural buffer of family gatherings and carefully timed handoffs of the kids. That structure had worked, imperfectly, but well enough to avoid the kind of conversations that tended to spiral into something unproductive. Unfortunately, plans, like most things Brian tried to keep orderly, had a habit of unraveling when least convenient. He had just dropped the kids off, lingering longer than usual in the driveway while they argued about whose turn it had been to pick the outing. Apparently the zoo still required arbitration days later, when a familiar car pulled up behind his own. Brian recognized it immediately. Of course, timing, it seemed, had decided to test him. His brother stepped out of the car, closing the door a little harder than necessary. There was a tension in his posture that Brian had learned to recognize long before the divorce made it more obvious. "Hey," his brother said, though the word carried no real warmth. "Hey," Brian replied evenly. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The silence stretched, thick with everything unsaid and everything both of them already expected the other to say. "You've been busy," his brother said. Brian raised an eyebrow. "That's one way to put it." "I drove by last Sunday," his brother continued. "Didn't stay. Just saw you." Brian exhaled slowly. He had a feeling he knew where this was going. "Then you already know how it went," he said. His brother let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, looked like a great time." "It was," Brian said, without hesitation. That response landed harder than anything defensive would have. His brother shifted his weight, crossing his arms. "You still bring her along every time?" Brian didn't pretend to misunderstand. "If she wants to come, yeah," he said. "She's my ex-wife, Brian." "She's their mother," Brian replied. "That's not the same thing." Brian took a step closer, keeping his voice calm but steady. "I'm not having this conversation again." "Then don't answer like it's not an issue," his brother shot back. "It is, at least for me." Brian studied him, really looked this time. Beneath the anger, beneath the frustration, there was something else, something less solid, less certain, something closer to fear. "Why?" Brian asked, not sharply, just directly. "Why is it an issue for you?" His brother opened his mouth, then stopped. The answer, whatever it was, didn't come out cleanly. "Because," he said finally, "it's not normal." Brian almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Normal?" he repeated. "You're going with that?" "You know what I mean," his brother said, frustration building. "People don't just keep acting like nothing changed." "I'm not acting like nothing changed," Brian replied. "I'm acting like the important parts didn't." "That's convenient for you." "No," Brian said, his tone sharpening slightly. "It's not convenient. It's consistent." The word hung there. Consistent. His brother looked away for a moment, jaw tightening. "You don't think it's weird that you're just still there? Like nothing happened?" Brian followed his gaze toward the house, where the faint silhouette of movement behind the curtains hinted that the kids hadn't gone far. "I think it would be weirder if I disappeared," he said quietly. "That's not what I'm saying." "It's exactly what you're saying," Brian countered. "You're just not putting it that way." His brother shook his head. "I just don't get how you can be so calm about it." Brian let out a slow breath. "Because I don't have the luxury of being anything else." That caught his brother off guard. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means," Brian said, choosing his words carefully, "that they're still kids. They didn't ask for any of this. And I'm not going to add to it by pretending their world is more broken than it already feels." His brother's expression flickered, something in it shifting, but not settling. "I'm not breaking anything," he said, softer now. "I didn't say you were," Brian replied. "But you're still in it, still reacting to it like it just happened." "It did just happen," his brother snapped. "No," Brian said, shaking his head slightly. "It ended a while ago. You're just catching up to it now." The words hit harder than Brian intended, but he didn't take them back. His brother ran a hand through his hair, pacing a short distance before turning back. "You think this is easy for me?" he asked. "No," Brian said. "I think it's hard. I think it's messy and frustrating, and probably not at all how you pictured things turning out." "Then why are you acting like I'm the problem?" "I'm not," Brian said. "I'm acting like you're still trying to win an argument that doesn't exist anymore." That stopped him. For a second, the air between them shifted, less combative, more uncertain. "What does that even mean?" his brother asked. Brian hesitated, then exhaled. "It means you're still focused on being right. And it didn't work," Brian said plainly. "It didn't work then, and it's not working now." His brother stared at him, the anger still there, but thinner now, less certain of itself. "That's not fair," he said. "It's not supposed to be," Brian replied. "It's just true." Silence settled again, heavier this time, but not explosive. Felt closer to something else, something uncomfortable but necessary. After a moment, his brother spoke again, quieter. "I saw you talking to her," he said. Brian knew exactly which moment he meant. "And?" Brian asked. "You looked normal," his brother said. "I am normal." "No," he shook his head. "I mean, you weren't tense or careful. You just talked to her." Brian frowned slightly. "Why would I be anything else?" His brother let out a breath, something in it edged with frustration at himself rather than Brian. "Because I can't do that," he admitted. That landed differently. Brian didn't respond right away. His brother continued, the words coming more unevenly now. "Every conversation turns into something," he said. "Something old or something unresolved. Or something I didn't even realize we were still arguing about." Brian leaned against his car, arms folding loosely. "That's because you never actually stopped arguing," he said. "That's not." His brother started, then stopped. "Because it was." He knew it. They both did. It wasn't supposed to end like this, his brother said finally, the anger draining out and leaving something more fragile behind. Brian nodded. It usually doesn't. We thought we could fix things, he went on. But every time we tried, it just turned into the same fight. About what? Everything, his brother said. Who was right? Who started it? Who didn't listen? It just kept repeating. Brian tilted his head slightly. Did either of you ever try to just listen? His brother huffed a short breath. That's what we were doing. No, Brian said gently. That's what you thought you were doing. He straightened, stepping forward just slightly. There's a difference between waiting for your turn to talk and actually hearing what someone's saying, he added. His brother looked at him, something shifting again, this time less defensive, more reflective. We didn't know how to stop, he admitted. Brian believed him. That was the problem with patterns, you didn't notice them when you were inside them. You can now, Brian said. His brother let out a tired laugh. Now? After everything? Brian shrugged lightly. Now's the first time you're actually questioning it. That hung in the air longer than the others. His brother looked toward the house again, quieter this time. She still talks to you, he said. Yeah, Brian replied. She doesn't talk to me like that. Brian considered his next words carefully. Because she's not trying to fight with me, he said. She's not expecting anything from me except honesty. His brother frowned. I was honest. Were you? Brian asked. The question wasn't sharp. It didn't need to be. Across the yard, a light flicked on in the house. His brother watched it for a moment, shoulders loosening slightly, as if something inside him had finally shifted. Just a little, but enough to matter. I don't think I was, he said quietly. Brian didn't respond. He didn't need to, because for the first time since the conversation began, it felt like his brother wasn't arguing anymore. He was thinking, and that, Brian knew, was where things really began. Chapter 6, The Honest Conversation. It wasn't unusual for Brian to stop by on a weekday evening. What was unusual was the reason. He rang the doorbell without overthinking it, something he trained himself to do when situations required action rather than analysis. If he paused too long, he'd start dissecting the decision, weighing outcomes, drafting possible conversations that rarely unfolded the way he imagined. The door opened a moment later. His former sister-in-law looked faintly surprised to see him there, but not uncomfortable. If anything, there was a quiet relief in her expression, as though an unexpected interruption might be exactly what she needed. Hey, she said softly. Everything okay? Yeah, Brian replied. He hesitated briefly, then chose honesty over polish. I was in the area. She smiled, just slightly. You don't really just happen to be in this area. That's fair, he admitted. She stepped aside. Come in. The kids are upstairs arguing about something deeply important. Brian walked in, glancing toward the staircase as faint voices filtered down. Raised but not distressed, the steady rhythm of sibling disagreement without real consequence. Sounds intense, he said. It's about a missing crayon, she replied. This could go on for hours. Brian nodded solemnly. High stakes. She moved back toward the kitchen, gesturing for him to follow. You want coffee? Always. She poured 2 cups without asking how he took it, handing one to him with the familiarity that had never faded, despite everything else shifting around it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't awkward. It never had been, not with her. That was part of why Brian had never understood the idea that their connection needed to change just because her relationship with his brother had. Something's up, she said finally, leaning lightly against the counter. Brian blew out a breath. That obvious? You don't show up midweek without a reason, she said. And you're thinking. I do that a lot, he said. Not like this, she replied. Brian let that sit for a moment, then nodded. Okay, he said. That's fair. She waited, not pressing, not rushing him, just holding the space open the way she always had. I talked to him, Brian said. She didn't need clarification. Her expression shifted slightly, not alarmed, but attentive. How did that go? She asked. Brian exhaled through a quiet half-smile. Depends on your definition of go. She huffed softly. That bad? No, Brian said. Not bad. Just overdue. That seemed to land. She looked down at her coffee, swirling it lightly before taking a sip. Yeah, she said. That sounds about right. Brian studied her for a moment, noting the subtle differences. The way she held herself a little tighter when his brother came up. The way her voice softened even when she didn't intend it to. How are you doing? He asked. She let out a quiet, ironic laugh. That's a loaded question. I know, he said, but I'm asking anyway. She leaned back against the counter, crossing her arms, her gaze drifting toward the window. I'm okay, she said slowly, which I know is the kind of answer people give when they don't want to explain everything. I'm not people, Brian replied. She smiled faintly at that. No, she said. You're not. The smile faded just as quickly as it came. I miss him, she admitted. The words landed without drama, without hesitation, but with a weight that didn't need embellishment. Brian didn't interrupt. I didn't think I would, she continued, her voice steady but quieter now. At least not like this. I thought it would be relief mostly. Less tension. Less fighting. Brian said nothing, letting her continue. And some of that is true, she added. The house is quieter. There's less pressure. She paused. But it's also emptier. Brian shifted slightly, leaning against the counter opposite her. That makes sense, he said gently. She let out a breath, shaking her head. We weren't supposed to end like that, Brian. I know. We kept telling ourselves we'd fix it, she said. Every time something went wrong, it was we'll figure it out, or we just need time. But it turned into the same fight, Brian finished. She looked up at him, surprised. He said that. Brian nodded. Her expression softened, something fragile flickering there. Of course he did, she murmured. Because it's true. They stood in silence for a beat, the shared understanding settling between them. I still love him, she said then, more quietly. Which is probably the part I'm not supposed to say. Brian didn't hesitate. Why wouldn't you say it? He asked. Because it makes everything more complicated, she replied. It doesn't have to, Brian said. She gave him a look, a tired, almost amused look. It absolutely does. Only if you treat it like a problem to solve, he said. She frowned slightly. What else would it be? Brian took a moment before answering, choosing his words carefully. It's information, he said. Not a problem, not a solution. Just something that exists whether you ignore it or not. She considered that, her brow furrowing slightly. That sounds like something you've been thinking about for a while, she said. I have, Brian admitted. She studied him more closely now. This isn't just about us, is it? Brian hesitated. No, he said. Emma? She asked, not accusing, just perceptive. Brian exhaled softly. Yeah. Her expression shifted again, this time warming slightly. I was wondering when that would come up, she said. It's not. Brian started, then stopped himself, because he didn't actually know how to finish that sentence. She smiled, faint but knowing. You don't bring someone up that often unless they matter at least a little. I didn't say she mattered, Brian replied. You didn't have to, she said. Brian shook his head, running a hand through his hair. It's not simple. It's not supposed to be, she said. That's exactly the problem, he replied. She laughed quietly. You really do want things to fit into neat boxes, don't you? It makes them easier to manage. And how's that working out for you this week? She asked gently. Brian didn't answer, which in itself was an answer. She softened slightly, her tone shifting. Look, she said. You know why we fell apart? Brian glanced up. You were both trying to win. She nodded. Exactly. We stopped listening. We stopped being curious about each other. She paused. Everything became a debate. Point to prove. That's what he said. Brian added. I believe it, she said. There was another quiet stretch. And that's what scares me, she admitted after a moment. About him? Brian asked. About trying again, she clarified. Because what if nothing's changed? What if we just fall right back into it? Brian thought about his brother's face in the driveway. The frustration, the doubt, the first flicker of self-awareness that had broken through. Something has changed, Brian said. She looked at him, cautious. What? He's not arguing, Brian said. Not the way he was. He's questioning things. Himself. She didn't respond right away, but her posture shifted, the tension easing just slightly. That's new, she said. Yeah, Brian agreed. She stared into her coffee again, turning that over. I don't know if that's enough, she admitted. It's not, Brian said. Not on its own. She looked up. But it's a start, he added. That hung there, uncertain but real. Upstairs, a door shut a little too loudly, followed by immediate footsteps, reconciliation moving quickly, as it always did with children who didn't hold grudges very long. Brian glanced toward the ceiling, then back at her. You both spent a lot of time trying to be right, he said. Maybe it's time to try something else. Like what? She asked. Brian met her gaze evenly. Listening, he said. She let out a small breath, something like hope and hesitation colliding at once. We tried that, she said. No, Brian replied quietly. You thought you did. She didn't argue, because somewhere deep down, she knew he was right. And for the first time since the divorce, that realization didn't feel like another failure. Felt like a possibility. Chapter 7 Mediating the Mess. Brian had not intended to become a mediator. In fact, if anyone had suggested even a week earlier that he would voluntarily sit his brother and his former sister-in-law in the same room and attempt to guide a meaningful conversation between them, he would have dismissed the idea outright. Sounded messy, unpredictable, exactly the kind of situation he had spent years quietly avoiding. And yet, standing in his apartment on a Sunday evening, having arranged childcare through his parents and deliberately choosing a neutral space, Brian found himself straightening a chair that didn't need straightening, adjusting details that weren't the real issue. He exhaled slowly. This was happening. The knock at the door came first. He opened it to find his brother, hands in his pockets, shoulders tense but not rigid. There was something different in his expression. Not calm, exactly, but quieter, less defensive. "You're serious about this?" his brother said, stepping inside. Brian nodded. "I wouldn't have asked otherwise." His brother glanced around the apartment, as if looking for an escape route that didn't exist. "And she's coming." "She said she would," Brian replied. That answer settled into the space between them just as another knock followed. His brother froze for half a second. Brian noticed. Then he moved, steady, and opened the door again. She stood there, composed but clearly aware of the weight of the moment. There was no anger in her expression, but there was caution, earned, not exaggerated. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," Brian responded. "Come in." She stepped inside, her eyes briefly flicking toward Brian's brother before settling somewhere neutral, somewhere safe. For a moment, all three of them simply stood there. "If this is a terrible idea," his brother said, the words coming out quicker than planned, "we don't have to." "It's not a terrible idea," Brian cut in gently. "It's just an uncomfortable one." Neither of them argued with that. "Sit," Brian added, gesturing toward the chairs he'd set up deliberately. Not across from each other, not in opposition, but angled just enough to allow conversation without forcing confrontation. They both hesitated. Then, slowly, they complied. Brian remained standing for a moment, watching them, reading the space the way he'd learned to read rooms full of tension that didn't yet know what it wanted to become. "Before either of you says anything," he began, "I'm going to set one rule." His brother let out a faint, skeptical breath. "Of course you are." "Yes," Brian said calmly, "because otherwise you're both going to fall into the same pattern." That got their attention. "No interrupting," he continued. "If the other person is talking, you listen, not waiting to respond, not planning what you're going to say next. Just listen." "That's," his brother started. Brian raised a hand. "No interrupting." His brother leaned back, exhaling sharply but not arguing further. She nodded slightly, understanding exactly what Brian was trying to do. "Good," Brian said, finally taking a seat slightly off to the side. Not in the middle, not in control, but present. There was a pause. Then, unexpectedly, she spoke first. "I didn't want it to end like that," she said. "Simple, direct, not accusatory." Brian's brother inhaled as if to respond immediately, but stopped. He caught himself. Brian noticed. That alone was progress. "I know," his brother said after a moment. His voice was quieter than Brian had heard it in a long time. "You say that now," she replied, not harshly but honestly. "But when we were in it, it didn't feel like that." He nodded slowly. "Because I wasn't listening." She blinked slightly, caught off guard. The admission hung in the air, unexpected but not unwelcome. "I wasn't either," she said after a beat. "I kept trying to prove you wrong instead of trying to understand what you were saying." Brian stayed silent, resisting the instinct to guide, to correct, to push. They were moving. It was slow, but it was real. "I thought if I explained myself enough, you just get it," his brother said. "Like it was obvious. Like you were choosing not to understand." "I thought the same thing about you," she admitted. A small, almost ironic smile crossed both their faces for a fleeting second, recognition without humor. "That's kind of the problem, isn't it?" she said. His brother huffed a short breath. "Yeah, turns out we were both right. And also completely wrong." Brian glanced between them, noting the shift. Not agreement, not resolution, but awareness. "That's a start," he said quietly. They both looked at him briefly, then back at each other. "I got tired," she said after a moment. "Every conversation felt like work. Like if I said the wrong thing, it would turn into something bigger than it needed to be." His brother nodded a little too quickly. "Same. I felt like I had to defend everything, even things that didn't matter." "Because we made everything matter," she replied. "Because we made everything a fight," he said. Another pause. But this one felt different. Less tense. More grounded. "I still love you," she said. The words landed with more weight than anything else that had been said so far. Brian's brother froze, not out of resistance, but because he hadn't expected to hear it spoken aloud. "I know," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "I just didn't think it mattered anymore." "It matters," she said. "It just doesn't fix anything by itself." Brian almost smiled at that. Information, not a solution. She was getting there. "I don't want to go back to how things were," she added. "Not if it just means we end up in the same place again." "I don't either," he said quickly. Then, softer, more deliberate. "I don't think I could handle that again." She studied him for a moment, searching for something. Certainty, maybe, or honesty. "What's different now?" she asked. His brother hesitated. Brian could see the moment forming, the split second where habit might take over, where defensiveness might slip back in. But it didn't. This time he paused. "Thought. I am," he said finally. Not a perfect answer, but a real one. She exhaled slowly, something in her shoulders loosening. That's not something I can just believe, she said. I know, he replied. I'm not asking you to. Not yet. Another step. Not forward exactly, but not backward either. Brian leaned back slightly, allowing himself a quiet breath. They were doing it. Actually doing it. Not perfectly. Not cleanly. But honestly, I think we need to start smaller, she said after a moment. Not fixing everything. Just talking without it turning into something else. That would be a solid upgrade, his brother said. She smiled faintly. So we try, she said. He nodded. We try. Brian looked between them, something steady settling in his chest. This wasn't resolution. It wasn't even close. But it was movement. And for the first time since the divorce, it was movement in the right direction. All right, he said, finally stepping back in. That's enough progress for one conversation. His brother glanced at him. You're ending it? I'm pausing it, Brian corrected. You don't run a marathon in one night. That would have been helpful to know earlier, his brother muttered. Brian smirked slightly. You wouldn't have listened. Fair, he admitted. She stood slowly, looking between them both. Thank you, she said quietly to Brian. Brian nodded. You did the hard part. His brother rose as well, lingering for a second before speaking again. Can we do this again? He asked, not to Brian, but to her. She considered it, then nodded. Yeah, she said. We can try. And just like that, the room felt lighter. Not resolved, not finished, but no longer stuck. As they headed toward the door, Brian remained where he was, watching them go. For once, he wasn't thinking about control, or clarity, or lines that needed to be drawn. He was thinking about something far less certain, and far more important, progress. Chapter 8, Taking the Risk. Brian did not immediately notice the shift. That, in itself, was unusual. He was used to noticing everything. Patterns, tone changes, the subtle cues that told him when something was about to go wrong or when a situation required adjustment. It had become second nature, part instinct, part habit reinforced by experience. But this change wasn't loud or disruptive. It was quiet, gradual, and somehow steady. Sunday afternoons continued, as they always had. The kids still argued about everything, from what counted as a real adventure to whether trying something new was brave or just unnecessary risk. The routine was intact, the structure unmoved. But within it, something had softened. His brother began to show up, not consistently at first and never perfectly, but enough to matter. A brief appearance during a pickup. A lingering conversation that didn't end in frustration. A question asked without an edge of defensiveness behind it. And Brian still thought of her as his sister-in-law regardless of technical accuracy. Met him halfway, carefully, deliberately, testing the ground before taking each step, but taking them nonetheless. They spoke more. Not about everything, but about something. And for once, those conversations didn't spiral outward into something unmanageable. They stayed where they were, grounded and contained. Not because they avoided difficult topics, but because they didn't try to win them. Brian noticed that. He just didn't comment on it. Because it wasn't his to lead anymore. It was theirs. You're doing it again. Brian glanced down as his niece walked alongside him. Her steps shorter, but just as purposeful. Thinking? He asked. Watching, she corrected. That's different, he said. It's not, she replied. It just sounds better when you say it. Brian huffed a quiet laugh. You're getting very good at this. I've had practice, she said. Ahead of them, his nephew was explaining something animatedly to Emma, who was listening with the same focused attention she always gave. Head tilted slightly, expression engaged, never dismissing the importance of whatever story he was telling. Brian watched them for a moment. There was no hesitation in her anymore. No sense that she was stepping into something unfamiliar. She moved through it all as though she belonged there. Not intruding, not inserting herself, just present. He found that he didn't question it, which was new. You should invite her, his niece said suddenly. Brian blinked. Invite her to what? His niece gave him a look. Anything. That's very specific. It is specific, she insisted. You only see her with us. Brian frowned slightly. That's not true. Name one time, she said. He opened his mouth, paused. That's not the point, he said. It is the point, she replied calmly. Brian rubbed his forehead. You're 8. That doesn't make me wrong. He exhaled slowly. Didn't. Later that afternoon, as the kids ran ahead toward a small playground they decided needed to be included in the day's plan, Brian found himself walking beside Emma again. It had become a familiar position, which he realized was part of the problem. Or maybe the point. They're very committed to this path, Emma said, watching the kids navigate toward the swings with unwavering certainty. They always are, Brian replied. The destination is secondary. It's about the decision. Emma smiled. That explains a lot. There was an easy silence between them for a few steps. Not empty, just comfortable. Brian cleared his throat slightly. Hey, he said. Emma glanced at him. Hey, I was thinking, he started, then stopped himself, immediately aware of how that sounded. Emma laughed softly. Of course you were. He nodded once. That's not going to change. I wouldn't expect it to, she said. He glanced ahead, then back at her. I realized something, he continued. About patterns. That sounds like you, she said lightly. Brian almost smiled, but this time it stayed. I've been treating things like they either fit or they don't, he said. Like if something doesn't make immediate sense, it's probably not worth pursuing. Emma nodded slowly, listening but not interrupting. And that's worked, he added. For the most part, it's kept things manageable. Manageable, she repeated. But not complete, he said, echoing her words from days earlier. Emma's expression shifted slightly, not surprised, but attentive. That's a new conclusion, she said. Yeah, he admitted. It is. The children called out in the distance, arguing over whose turn it was to go first on the swings. Brian glanced toward them briefly, then back to Emma. So, he said, taking a breath that felt more deliberate than usual. I was wondering if you'd want to. He stopped, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he did. And that was the part that required something he hadn't allowed himself in a long time. Risk. Emma waited, her expression open, but not pushing. You know, Brian continued, quieter now, but steadier. Something that's not part of the routine. She tilted her head slightly, a hint of curiosity in her eyes. Define not part of the routine, she said. Brian let out a soft breath. That's the part I'm working on, he replied. Emma studied him for a moment, and then, gradually, her smile returned. Less playful this time, more certain. I'd like that, she said. The answer came easily, without hesitation. And instead of unsettling him, it did something far more unexpected. Settled him. Across the playground, his nephew finally launched himself off the swing at an angle Brian would have once intervened in immediately, landing with a triumphant shout rather than disaster. See? His niece called out. It worked. Brian shook his head, watching them regroup for another attempt. It usually does, Emma said softly. Brian glanced at her. Not always, he replied. Not always, she agreed. But enough. He nodded once. Enough. For the first time in a long time, that word didn't feel like a compromise. Felt like a beginning. Behind them, his brother and his former sister-in-law were walking closer than they had been weeks before. Not touching, not fully resolved, but not distant either. Their conversation moved in quieter tones now, without the sharp edges Brian had grown used to hearing. Still unfinished. Still uncertain. But moving. Brian turned back toward the playground, toward the noise and laughter that had always grounded him. And for once, he didn't feel like he was standing outside of something. He felt like he was stepping into it. Not because it was guaranteed. Not because it was clear. But because, finally, he was willing to find out. Epilogue, 2 years later. 2 years had a way of softening edges Brian once thought permanent. Not erasing them, he was realistic enough to know that didn't happen, but reshaping them into something less sharp, less reactive, less defining. If someone had asked him back then what progress would look like, he would have struggled to answer. He would have described something structured, measurable, predictable. Something that could be tracked and confirmed, something that made sense. Now, standing in his brother's backyard on a warm Saturday afternoon, Brian understood that progress didn't announce itself. It revealed itself, quietly, in moments like this. Uncle Brian. He turned just in time to catch his nephew mid-launch, a maneuver that had become slightly more coordinated with age but had not lost any of its reckless enthusiasm. Brian steadied him easily. You're getting predictable. I'm getting better, the boy corrected, grin. Angie. Debatable, Brian said. Nearby, his niece, now just a little taller, just a little more self-assured, rolled her eyes. He practices that jump. I do not. You do, she insisted. Brian smiled, watching the familiar rhythm of their argument unfold, but something about it felt different. Not the energy, not the connection, just the context. Behind them, his brother stood with his wife. Brian made a quiet point of thinking the word fully now, no qualifiers attached. Both of them engrossed in assembling something that looked vaguely like outdoor furniture but had clearly already tested their patience. Hold that steady, she said. I am holding it, his brother replied. You're tilting it. I'm not tilting it, the ground is uneven. She paused, then laughed. A light, unexpected sound. Okay, she said. That might actually be true. His brother smirked slightly. See? Growth. Don't get used to it, she warned. But there was no tension in it. No sharp edge. Just ease. It hadn't been overnight. It hadn't even been quick. 6 months in couples counseling had come first. Something they both committed to without hesitation once they decided to try again. Not because they thought it would fix everything, but because they finally understood that figuring it out on their own had been part of the problem. Brian had watched it unfold from the edges, guiding less, observing more, letting them build something new instead of trying to repair something that had already worn itself thin. Now, the difference was unmistakable. Not perfect, not flawless, but intentional. You're doing it again. Brian glanced to his left, already anticipating the comment. Emma stood beside him, her hands loosely tucked into the back pockets of her jeans, her gaze drifting between the kids and the quiet, steady teamwork happening behind them. Observing? He asked. She smiled faintly. Reflecting. That's new terminology. It feels more accurate, she said. Brian considered that. It did. I guess it is, he admitted. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the space around them. The laughter, the movement, the small, ordinary pieces of something that had once felt uncertain, now simply present. Their own rhythm had never required rebuilding. It had never broken. It had simply grown, naturally, steadily, without pressure, without timelines they felt obligated to meet. 2 years ago, Brian might have tried to define what they were too quickly. He might have searched for clarity before allowing the connection to settle, tried to categorize something that wasn't ready for labels yet. Now, he understood that some things became clear precisely because you gave them the space to. Hey, Emma said, her tone shifting slightly. Brian turned toward her. She held something small in her hand, something he hadn't noticed before. I need your opinion, she said lightly, though there was something beneath it, something quiet and anticipatory. On what? He asked. Instead of answering immediately, she placed it gently into his hand. Brian looked down. For a second, his brain didn't quite process what he was seeing. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was unexpected in a way that short-circuited his usual thought patterns. Then it clicked. 2 lines. Clear. Undeniable. He blinked once, then again, and then he looked up. Emma was watching him, not nervously, but not casually either. Her expression open, steady, giving him the space to react however he needed to. You're serious, he said. She nodded once. Very. For a moment, the world around him seemed to quiet. Not disappear, but soften, like it had stepped back just enough to give this moment room. Brian let out a slow breath, his grip tightening slightly around the test before he caught himself. He started, then stopped. Because for once, there wasn't an immediate framework to step into. No pattern to follow. No clear line to draw. Just something real. Something new. Something that didn't need to be analyzed before it could be felt. I'm going to be a father, he said finally, the words landing fully as he spoke them. Emma smiled softly. Yeah, you are. He let out a quiet laugh, not out of disbelief but out of something closer to release. All the thoughts he'd carried for years, about missed opportunities, about timing, about whether that part of his life might pass him by, shifted in an instant. Not erased. Not invalidated. Just redefined. Brian looked past her for a moment, toward his brother, who was now gesturing animatedly while his wife shook her head in amused exasperation. 2 years ago, he hadn't thought this scene would exist. Not like this. Not in this form. And now his life was expanding again. Not disrupting. Expanding. He looked back at Emma. There was no hesitation this time. No need to categorize or measure or contain what this moment meant. Well, he said, exhaling slowly, a small smile forming. That changes things. Emma tilted her head slightly. Does it? Brian considered it. It clarifies things, he corrected. She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. He glanced down at the test again, then back at her. The thought came easily, naturally, like it had been waiting quietly, patiently, for the right moment to surface. I think I've been thinking about the next step, he said. Emma's expression softened, a quiet warmth settling in her eyes. Have you? She asked. Brian nodded once. Yeah, he said simply. I have. There was no rush in it. No urgency driven by expectation. Just the same steady certainty that had carried him through everything else that mattered. He was going to be a father. And this time, the future didn't feel like something he had to question. It felt like something he was ready to walk toward. The only thing left, he met her gaze, calm and certain, was becoming a husband.